Twilight at Monticello, The Final Years of Thomas Jefferson, by Pell Crawford. Narrated by James Boles. Copyright 2008 by Pell Crawford. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Pell Crawford and writers' representatives, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Prologue. I shall be forever at ease. Monday, February 1st, 1819, began quietly, as did most days at Monticello during the 10 years in which Thomas Jefferson had been retired from public life. It would end far differently. Jefferson, as usual, rose at dawn, perhaps singing softly to himself as he often did when engaged in some pleasurable pursuit. He laid the hearth with his own hands, recorded the temperature, and bathed his feet in cold water, a practice to which he attributed his long life. He was 75 now, and while his once red hair was gray and he stooped a bit, he could still do most things for himself, and this was a point of pride with Jefferson. He still possessed all his teeth. Jefferson could also ride again, which he had been unable to do a few months ago when, after a visit to the mineral springs in the Blue Ridge, he suffered from an extremely painful system of boils on his backside, the treatment for which an ointment of sulfur and mercury seemed only to make matters worse. For weeks he was brought low by blood poisoning which almost killed him. Some New York papers reported that he had died. During the worst of it, in August and September, if he had the energy to make the 2-mile trip into Charlottesville or wished to visit a neighbor's plantation, he was bounced about in horse-drawn carriages over the rough roads of hilly Albemarle County, Virginia. For weeks the pain was such that he couldn't sit up. When he wrote letters, a major part of his daily routine for many years, but one that he was beginning to find irksome, he had to do so lying down. Now he could once again move about in the saddle or on foot, but he was not as strong as he had been before and would never be again. After breakfast, tea or coffee with warm muffins, served in the dining-room at 8, he would leave the house, on some occasions helped by his butler and valet, a slave named Burwell Colbert, who grew up at Monticello and as a child had worked in Jefferson's nail-making shop. Together they would make their way toward the kitchen garden, 100 feet or so southeast of the pavilion that jutted out from Jefferson's private chambers on Monticello's first floor. With Burwell at his side, he picked his way cautiously along the red clay path that led past the rank-smelling privy vent, and down a short but sharp decline to the gate in the 10-foot-high paling fence built alongside Mulberry Row. That was where the workshop stood, one after another in a line that intersected the path from the house to the garden and led to the old family graveyard. Jefferson loved order, symmetry, and balance, and there was no place on the mountaintop more orderly, symmetrical, and balanced than the garden, which he had designed many years ago and worked to perfect for half a century. Jefferson had started the garden in 1769, a year before he even began to build his house. Inside the fence, whose boards were set close together so as not to let even a young hare in, the garden stretched for 1,000 feet. The 2-acre enclosure was itself neatly subdivided into 24 squares, each devoted to a different plant. This being February, the ground in some spots was still hard from winter's chill, muddy in others. Even when the weather was raw, Jefferson would inspect with boyish glee the condition of the vegetables and medicinal herbs that grew, pale green to a ghostly gray in winter. There were turnips and leeks and broccoli for the table, but much of what was planted in the garden was intended for medicinal use. The more incapacitated Jefferson became from headaches, rheumatism, and chronic diarrhea, the more dependent he became on his garden pharmacy. There was French lavender, which his copy of the Edinburgh New Dispensary recommended for disorders of the head, and thyme prescribed by Culpeper's Complete Herbal for stomach ailments which expels wind. If thyme did not do the trick, Jefferson could try home remedies made with rosemary and wormwood. To treat his rheumatism, he turned to various topical medications that used pepper plants. For most vegetables, he would of course have to wait. When spring returned in another month or two, the next season's produce would be ready for the consumption of Jefferson's large family and for the many visitors who showed up at the plantation expecting to be fed. The Spinacia oleracea, or spinach, he had planted the week before on January 26. Peas went in the next day. By the first week in February, directing the activities of the slaves who worked in the garden, he would see to it that the celery seeds were properly sown. The slaves would have to be closely supervised. If they weren't watched, he thought, they could be careless in their duties, or deceitful. Such conclusions did not come easily to Jefferson, who worried about slavery, and about individual slaves his entire life. Some slaves could be quite trustworthy. This was true, for example, of the members of the Hemmings family who served as maids and waiters at Monticello, or were craftsmen in the workshops near the garden. Others Jefferson considered less reliable. 2 weeks earlier, on January 17, Jefferson had written to tell Joel Yancey, the overseer at Poplar Forest, a plantation he owned about 90 miles south of Monticello in Bedford County, to be especially careful when assigning tasks to a slave there named Dick. The previous year, Dick had brought a wagon load of produce from the Bedford County plantation that at first inspection seemed to contain everything Jefferson expected. He learned later, however, that the slave did not deliver a bag containing a bushel of dried peaches, which he said had dropped through a hole in the bottom of his wagon, although no hole was seen which could have let such a mass through. More recent than that, Jefferson noticed that Dick delivered a load of soap that weighed 38 pounds rather than, as should have been the case, 45. And the barrel of apples he brought is a little more than half full. Such repeated accidents cannot but excite suspicions of him, sufficient to make us attentive in the future. Eternal vigilance may have been the price of liberty, it was most assuredly a cost of owning slaves. Overseers had to be watched as well. Some of them drove the slaves too hard. The deaths of 5 slave children in the last 4 years made Jefferson wonder whether the white men in his employ were allowing the mothers sufficient time to care for their infants. Too many overseers rushed the women back into the fields as quickly as possible, which was short-sighted. Jefferson concurred in the belief widely held among planters that slave women were of greater value than slave men. Women bore children and therefore added to the labor force. Male field hands, by contrast, consumed as much as they produced. I consider the labor of a breeding woman as no object, he reminded the overseer, and that a child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man. While the labor of a slave woman is important, it is their increase which is the first consideration with us. Until the overseers understood that fact, needless inefficiencies would result. There was nothing complicated in the matter, though Jefferson found something wonderful in it. Here, as in so many areas of life, nature had made it agreeable for man to do what was virtuous. It was proper to allow the slave women to look after their babies, and the master was repaid many times over when he permitted them to do so. In this, as in all other cases, Jefferson had decided, Providence has made our interests and our duties coincide perfectly. On these morning walks in the garden, Jefferson loved to reflect on the happy economies of the natural order. The older he got, the more he appreciated the sublime pleasures of the life of the mind, to which he now sought to devote himself almost exclusively. He also took great delight in sharing his enthusiasm for nature with others. Many times on these garden walks he would be accompanied by his grandchildren, Meriwether Lewis Randolph, perhaps, who had just turned 9, or the boy's sister, Septimia, who was 5. In earlier years, Jefferson's favored companion on these outings had always been their much older sister, Anne Carey Randolph, now Anne Bankhead. Jefferson's first grandchild, Anne was a delicate woman whose love of garden plants had been almost as ardent as his own. But Anne was grown up now, married with children of her own, living on a plantation on the western slope of the mountain half a mile away. Deprived of Anne's company, but enjoying that of her younger siblings, Jefferson would make his way, hand in hand with Meriwether Lewis and Septimia, between the neat rows of plantings in this 90,000-square-foot Eden. Along the way, in his soft, somewhat reedy voice, Jefferson discoursed on nature and its splendors, and for reasons the children never quite understood, insisted on using important-sounding Latin names for perfectly ordinary things such as squash and woolly worms. He would explain with great patience exactly what had been planted where, when it would come up, and how soon it would be brought to the table. Jefferson would speculate, too, about the trees and the flowers and the animals on the property. His observations in past years indicated that the red maples would bloom as early as February 18, 3 weeks away. The cherry trees would begin to display their fragile blossoms in the second week of March. A week later the asparagus would be ready for picking. He would hear the first whippoorwill crying plaintively in the night by April 2nd, the first robin 3 weeks after that. Ticks would show up in mid-March, but the family would not have to contend with houseflies until late April. By then, when Jefferson would turn 76, all the songbirds would bring their music to the mountain-top. But it was still winter on the mountain, and Jefferson often found himself shivering and shrinking from the cold as he told Charles Thompson, an old friend from Revolutionary days. When the chill got to him, and it surely did on this morning, he left the near barren garden and returned to the house where the fireplaces smoked and the house slaves would be tending to their chores. Then, bidding the little ones to be about their lessons or their play, Jefferson disappeared into his private chambers. Putting on his glasses, he sat at his writing table and answered letters. The physical act of writing had become painful, thanks to a stiff right hand caused 30 years earlier in a rare moment of romantic abandon for which he would pay the rest of his life. In September 1786, on a walk alongside the Seine with the beautiful and married Maria Causeway, Jefferson, the U.S. Minister to France, tried to leap a fence. He came crashing to the ground, fracturing his wrist, which never healed. How the right hand became disabled, he wrote to a friend in the American legation in London shortly after the embarrassing mishap, would be a long story for the left to tell. It was one of those follies from which good cannot come, but ill may. These days writing was nearly as wearisome as it had been when the wrist was first injured and he had taught himself to write with his left. More than that, Jefferson found that he had less patience than he once had with the inquiries of strangers. When his hand was too tired to write any more, he turned to reading. He had canceled his subscriptions to the out-of-state newspapers, but he still took the Richmond Enquirer for the advertisements, which he considered the only truths to be relied on in a newspaper. He retained an insatiable appetite for books, however, as he told John Adams the year before, when Adams sent him a copy of John Pickering's essay on the pronunciation of the Greek language, which Jefferson read with great pleasure. He would soon receive from his old friend in Massachusetts a copy of the Nathaniel Bowditch translation of Laplace's Mécanique Céleste with commentaries. Until then, Jefferson was once again losing himself in Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War, in Greek, of course. Now that he had long since retired from politics, Jefferson told Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina on January 12, 1819, he could slumber without fear and review in my dreams the visions of antiquity. This willful escape into pleasing reveries made life's harsher realities endurable in ways that they otherwise were not. Enthroned at Monticello, where the clouds themselves seemed to shroud the mountain-top in an agreeable if ghostly intangibility, Jefferson professed to ignore events beyond the walls of his own bedchamber, or at most the gates of Monticello, but this was disingenuous. Jefferson kept abreast of political developments largely through correspondence with such friends as his Albemarle County neighbor James Monroe, who had succeeded James Madison of adjacent Orange County in the presidency, or with Madison himself. Jefferson would never cease to fret about the future of the republic at whose birth he had played such a significant role. The survival of this exercise in self-government, the first in the history of the world, he believed, could never be taken for granted, as each day brought new dangers. The country's economy had never fully recovered from the War of 1812, and the news out of Washington had been discouraging for months. This was especially so for the honest and independent farmers whom Jefferson considered the backbone of this historic experiment in political liberty. Even now, in February 1819, these farmers had good reason to fear that their future, as well as that of republicanism itself, was at stake. As winter gave way to spring and rain turned Virginia's roads into mud wallows, the planters' sleep and much of the nation's would be haunted by two developments that very few Southerners were prepared to cope with, or even understand. These two issues, intertwined in many ways, would haunt Jefferson throughout his retirement. His family would wrestle with their implications for long years after their patriarch had departed. The nation itself would struggle with them for the next half-century, and never put them fully to rest even then. The first involved the form of the American economy, a question forced to the forefront by actions of the Second Bank of the United States, a Hamiltonian institution that Jefferson regarded as unconstitutional and had opposed. The second issue concerned the future of the slave system on which the Southern economy was based. The settlers of Missouri had applied for statehood, and factions in the North were attempting to prohibit slavery within the new state's borders. This attempt Jefferson also considered unconstitutional. How these two dramas played out over the months and years to come would have enormous implications for the planters, their families, and their way of life. Jefferson himself could not yet fathom their enormity, though within a matter of months no American North or South would be able to escape their consequences. By January and February 1819, however, everyone knew this much. The price of tobacco, wheat, and corn had been falling for several years, hit hard by competition from the cheaper and more fertile farms south and west of the Appalachians, where ambitious and energetic men had been moving in great numbers since Jefferson left the presidency. For decades now, even the biggest planters had been getting by on credit extended on the presumed value of next year's crop. The planters lived on hope and no small measure of self-delusion, borrowing wherever they could, including from one another. Just 12 days ago, on January 21st, Jefferson himself, strapped for cash, had borrowed $50 from James Leitch, a Charlottesville storekeeper. The first signal that such habits could not be sustained indefinitely had come 6 months earlier in the summer of 1818. About the time the peaches at Monticello ripened and the Indian corn was ready for harvest, the Second Bank of the United States, having mismanaged its own affairs, curtailed its lending and put pressure on its branch banks in the states to curtail theirs. Suddenly, many planters found it impossible to renegotiate their loans, and in some cases had to pay them back in full. By December 1818, a shortage of paper money left Virginia planters with few assets but land and slaves, which they already possessed in surplus. What Jefferson did not know, no one could, was that by the end of February the whole country would be in the grip of a severe economic depression. In the coming panic of 1819, banks would go under, unemployment in the towns of the North would reach all-time highs, and shops, apothecaries, and taverns would close their doors. In the easy-going South, bankruptcy laws would suddenly be taken seriously for the first time in memory, and the courts began to enforce these laws, as was routinely done in New England. Once wealthy and respected gentlemen with venerable genealogies were forced off their ancestral plantations. Crops, land, and slaves were sold for whatever price the planters could get. As more energetic Virginia planters struggled mightily to save themselves, and as far too many of their less vigorous neighbors merely looked on in helpless, horrified, sometimes drunken disbelief, rancorous debate raged in the Congress over what to do about Missouri. In February, amendments were offered to the Missouri statehood bill prohibiting the further introduction of slavery into the Louisiana Territory, acquired in 1803 during Jefferson's first term. The amendments would also free, at age 25, all slaves who were born in Missouri after it became a state. These amendments passed the House, where the Northerners enjoyed a narrow majority, but they lost in the Senate, where the South still held sway. When Congress adjourned in March, the slavery question was left unresolved and would not, of course, be settled once and for all for another 46 years at Appomattox Courthouse, a day's carriage ride southeast of Charlottesville. Although Jefferson had been critical of slavery, he also believed that the federal government had no constitutional authority to tell a state whether it could or could not allow slavery to exist within its borders. Still, he counseled calm forbearance. Yes, he told his neighbors, the northern states were playing a dangerous game. This attempt to impose their will on their southern brethren, dangerous to southern property owners, it went without saying, was dangerous as well to the interests of the North. The plantations of the South, he reminded his neighbors, provided the bread and butter on which the rising manufacturing and navigating interest of the North depended. As reasonable men, Jefferson believed the Northerners would realize their folly soon enough, and when they did, their better, more rational nature would reassert itself. When their passions cooled, the Northerners would return to the embraces of their natural and best friends. On the first day of February, 1819, Jefferson felt increasingly worried about the planters' financial plight and his own. Money was tight, but this difficulty, Jefferson told himself, was surely temporary. He and his family at Monticello and at other farms within a few miles, plantations called Carlton, Tufton, and Edgehill, might need to cut back on their expenditures, but not forever. Jefferson had been saying as much for several years. Yes, the seas look stormy right now, he had written in 1815, when his family first began to be hard-pressed. But they would live as long, eat as much, and drink as much, as if the wave had already glided under the ship. Somehow or other, these things find their way out as they come in, and so I suppose they will now. Jefferson himself was deeply in debt. He had borrowed considerable sums from a number of banks and co-signed loans for friends, but he never kept track of how much debt he carried at any time. Whatever the sum, he operated in the belief that he could rescue his family from these obligations with minimal inconvenience. All he had to do was sell some of his undeveloped acreage in Bedford County, near his poplar forest plantation. Profits from the sale would enable him to pay back everything he owed, and once this was done, I shall be forever at ease. His family, he believed, would be taken care of for the rest of his life and beyond. Jefferson did not want to sell his land, no self-respecting planter did, but if that was required to provide for those he loved, he would try to find the strength to do it. In time, he trusted, the great plantations would be productive again, and the times of hardship would pass. Provided the country's diplomats performed their jobs rationally and with due care, and provided that foreign governments did not act rashly, there would always be markets for Virginia's tobacco and wheat. If only Jefferson's neighbors could be made to adopt more scientific agricultural methods, so the soil was not depleted so rapidly, prosperity would return. Wishing would make it so, Jefferson believed, that and purposeful activity. A lifetime of practice had taught Jefferson that the secret of happiness was the diligent avoidance of despair, and despair was most efficiently avoided by keeping busy. No matter how bleak one's external circumstances might be, and they seemed bleak indeed to many Virginia planters in the first months of 1819, facing them with a resolutely optimistic frame of mind was half the battle. In the unlikely event that this approach failed, and life's difficulties seemed insurmountable, the challenge was to bend as cheerfully as possible to nature's will. Remaining cheerful, however, would soon become more difficult than Jefferson imagined. When his reading was done and he was ready for his morning ride, Jefferson still had much to feel hopeful about. His plans to establish a new university for Virginia were being debated in the state legislature in Richmond, and he might well receive news this very day that a dream many years in the making was about to come true. Eager to embark on his morning's exercise, Jefferson was helped into the saddle, took the reins, and urged his horse down the path leading away from the gates that sealed off the house and yard from the rest of the plantation. For the next 2 or 3 hours he rode about the property, applying, whenever necessary, the small whip that he carried. In warmer months, when the red clay fields were being worked, he would inspect the farms. Should he come upon a group of slaves who did not appear to be laboring as hard as they might, Jefferson would pull his horse to a halt and shake the whip at them, a bit of play-acting that a French visitor, the Comte de Volney, had observed at Monticello. Jefferson also enjoyed riding through the dense wilderness of red cedars and willow oaks that covered the mountain. On long summer days he could enjoy the inspiring views to the west. The peaks of Otter might be the highest in all of North America, he believed, and to the east the oceanic immensity of fields and pastures and woodlands that command all the neighboring heights as far as the Chesapeake, in the words of another French visitor. On winter nights, when the weather was clear, Jefferson could see Castor and Pollux, Canis Major and the Pleiades. His enjoyment of the science of astronomy was impossible, of course, without proper instruments. So tomorrow, on February 2nd, he would send $10 to William Davenport in Philadelphia. Davenport, an instrument maker in the former national capital, was repairing Jefferson's telescope. This telescope would enable him to study the heavens more carefully, and to observe the ongoing construction at Charlottesville of the new University of Virginia, to which, provided the state came up with the money, Jefferson would devote so much of his energy in the 7 years of life left to him. Even before the legislature had committed itself to the project, Jefferson and the other members of the prospective school's board of trustees had ordered construction to begin. Ever since his earliest days in the Virginia legislature, Jefferson had dreamed of establishing in his own home county an institution of higher learning to rival Harvard, or the College of New Jersey at Princeton. The lawmakers in Richmond had been debating the matter of funding the university for several weeks, and as Jefferson told John Adams on January 19, 1819, "We are all a tiptoe here in the hourly expectation of what our legislature decides." By 3 or 4 o'clock, when the dinner bell rang at Monticello, Jefferson was back on the mountain top, weary from his ride and hoping for a favorable report from Richmond. Instead, he received news of a far different and very distressing nature. Sometime that afternoon, near the Charlottesville courthouse, there had been a fight. His beloved grandson, Jeff Randolph, had been stabbed. The wounds were serious. No one knew whether he would survive. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, born at Monticello in September 1792, was the first son of Martha Jefferson Randolph Jefferson.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?